34 years ago, a 2-year-old boy named Thomas Gibson vanished from his own front yard in rural Oregon, disappearing without a trace under the watch of his father, a local sheriff's deputy. What began as a desperate search turned into one of the most haunting cases in the Pacific Northwest, filled with silence, suspicion, and secrets buried in plain sight. But decades later, a single confession from a child would bring everything back to the surface, forcing the world to ask, what really happened to little Tommy Gibson on that quiet March morning? Before we uncover the truth, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you're drawn to true stories that never let go, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. March of 1991 began like any other in the quiet hills of Douglas County, Oregon. But for the Gibson family, that calm morning would fracture their world forever. 2-year-old Thomas Gibson, Tommy to everyone who loved him, vanished from his own front yard, a place no bigger than a living room, while his father, Larry Gibson, a respected sheriff's deputy, was out for a jog. Hialeah, Oregon, was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where life slowed after the mills closed, and neighbors waved to one another on gravel roads that wound through the pines. On March 18th, the Gibsons woke to the sound of the creek murmuring behind their single-story home at the end of that road. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and wood smoke. It was one of those mornings that feels so ordinary, you'd never think it could carry tragedy in its silence. Larry, 34, had the day off, a rarity. Judith, his wife, was in the kitchen rinsing breakfast plates while the television hummed faintly from the living room. Their daughter Karen played nearby, and little Tommy had already wandered outside, where the grass still sparkled with dew. He pushed his toy truck back and forth, leaving tiny, perfect tracks in the damp ground. Larry stepped onto the porch, lacing up his running shoes, and paused to watch his son. The yard wasn't much, maybe 20 feet deep before it met the fence, but to a toddler, it was an entire world. Judith called out from inside that Karen would be joining them soon. Larry told her he'd only be gone for a short run, a couple of miles, no more. Like many deputies, he carried his service pistol even when off duty, a habit that was part safety, part reflex. He checked the gate latch, told Tommy to wait for his sister, and started down the gravel drive. The little boy lifted his chubby hand in a wave. "Bye-bye, Daddy," he called out, his voice bright and small against the still morning air. Larry jogged along the familiar stretch of road that curved past open fields and dipped toward a cluster of pines. About half a mile in, movement flickered near the ditch. A gray cat he recognized from the neighbor's place, the same one that had been tearing into his trash cans for weeks. Out here, you didn't call animal control. You handled things yourself. Annoyed, Larry drew his Colt .45, aimed toward the brush, and fired a single shot. The sound cracked through the quiet, scattering a few crows from a fence post. He waited, saw nothing move, and holstered the weapon. Just another small irritation gone, forgotten by the next breath. His run stretched longer than intended, the kind where the rhythm of your steps clears the noise in your head. The air smelled of pine and wet bark, the kind of scent that makes you think everything's steady in the world. When he finally turned back and jogged up the driveway, his watch read 12:15. Judith was standing on the porch, one hand shading her eyes. Her voice sliced through the stillness. "Larry, he's not with you, is he?" Larry stopped mid-step. "Who?" "Tommy. I can't find him." At first, he thought she must be mistaken. The yard looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, the swing hanging crooked, the toy truck tipped on its side, the gate cracked open just an inch wider than before. He called out his son's name, then louder. Nothing. He checked behind the porch steps, the woodpile, the shed. Judith ran along the ditch, her voice rising with panic. They circled the house again and again until their throats were raw, the silence between each call growing heavier. When there was still no trace, Larry grabbed the patrol car parked by the drive and sped up the road, horn blaring. He stopped at the nearest intersection, called out, turned around, and came back, Judith was standing in the yard, crying now, her hands trembling. At 12:55, they made the call no parent ever wants to make. 2-year-old male, the dispatcher repeated calmly. Last seen in front yard. Blonde hair, blue eyes, no known medical issues. By 1:30, patrol units began to arrive. A volunteer firefighter from Alia pulled up first, then neighbors, church friends, and even men from Larry's old scout troop. Within an hour, the quiet gravel road was lined with trucks, cars, and flashing lights. Searchers moved through the fields, the creek, the woods beyond, calling Tommy's name into the Oregon wind. But the only answer that came back was the echo of their own voices. By early afternoon, what had once been a quiet country road had transformed into the nerve center of a desperate search. The sheriff's office set up a makeshift command post beside the Gibsons' mailbox. A folding table, a stack of maps, and a thermos of black coffee that no one had time to drink. Search dogs arrived first, their noses low to the ground, handlers leading them in slow, deliberate circles through the yard and down the road. For a brief, electrifying moment, the dogs caught a scent near the gate and followed it for about 50 yards. Then, just as suddenly, the trail evaporated at the curve. Above, helicopters thundered through the sky, their blades slicing the air and sending clouds of dust spiraling across the field. On the ground, men waded knee-deep through the creek, combing every patch of tall grass, checking under porches, sheds, and along the old woodpile. Time became a blur. Judith moved like a ghost, answering questions, retracing steps, her voice dull from exhaustion. Larry paced the perimeter again and again, his expression frozen in something between control and disbelief. When deputies asked how long he'd been gone, he said about 45 minutes. They wrote it down without comment. By 4 o'clock, the search grid had spread nearly 2 miles in every direction. Neighbors scoured their barns and fields. Volunteer firefighters tied strips of orange tape to mark cleared sections. Still nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a single sign of a 2-year-old boy. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the air turned cold. Someone passed out paper cups of coffee. Another offered to drive Judith into town to rest, but she refused. "He'll come back here," she said firmly, eyes on the yard. "He always comes back." Larry disappeared into the house for a few minutes. When he returned, he was dressed in full uniform, tan shirt pressed, badge polished, sidearm secured. "It feels right," he said when someone asked. "Like I need to look official." Judith said nothing. She just wrapped her arms around herself and stared into the empty yard. By 6 o'clock, the sheriff called the search to a temporary halt. "We'll start again at first light," he told the crowd quietly. "We're not done." Volunteers nodded, pale and weary, the orange glow of sunset painting their faces. One man picked up Tommy's yellow toy truck from the grass and set it gently on the porch railing, as if returning it to its rightful place. When the last of the vehicles rumbled away, silence took over again. Judith stood on the porch, arms crossed tight against the chill, and Larry beside her, scanning the shadows as if his son might simply walk back into view. Through the windows, the kitchen lights glowed faintly. Lunch was still on the table, sandwiches untouched. The swing in the yard creaked once in the wind. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The world had shrunk to that patch of grass where Tommy had last stood, and the hollow quiet that surrounded it. On the hood of a patrol car, a folded map marked the search grids in red ink, circles closing in on nothing. At dawn the next morning, March 19th, the search began again. Deputies from neighboring counties arrived, along with off-duty officers, firefighters, and volunteers from the local Mormon church. Among the first to show up was Larry's own Boy Scout troop, teenagers in green uniforms, clutching flashlights and walkie-talkies, moving through the brush in careful lines as they called the boy's name. By mid-morning, more than 100 people were in motion. Helicopters skimmed low over Swamp Creek, while mounted deputies searched the far banks. The fog rolled in from the hills, thick and cold, swallowing the sound of every shout. Through it all, Larry remained calm, methodical, clipboard in hand, giving orders, marking zones on the map. Those who knew him said he looked like a man simply doing his job. Those who didn't found his composure unsettling. Judith stayed near the house, refusing to rest. Every time a vehicle slowed by the driveway, she looked up, hoping. None brought the news she prayed for. By noon, the sheriff decided to expand the search another mile in every direction. Larry nodded in agreement and stepped inside. When he came back out, he was freshly shaved, dressed again in his tan uniform. Even his badge caught the weak sunlight as if polished just moments before. No one had ever seen a parent of a missing child look so official. Deputies whispered among themselves. One later noted in his report, "Gibson appeared unusually composed, maintains control but lacks effect. States he needs to look professional for the media." By the second day, that media had arrived in full force. News vans from Portland lined the narrow gravel road. Cameras rolling as reporters broadcast live from the makeshift command post outside the Gibson home. What had begun as a family's private tragedy was now a story the whole state would soon be watching. By the second day, the story had broken far beyond Douglas County. Television crews from Portland crowded the gravel road outside the Gibson home, camera lights cutting through the fog. Larry stood before the microphones, uniform pressed, face unreadable. "We're doing everything we can," he said evenly. "Every minute counts." His voice didn't waver, not once. Judith stood beside him, pale, silent, her eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd. In the days that followed, the search expanded like ink bleeding across paper. Crews swept through the same fields, creeks, and back roads again and again. Deputies marked off abandoned sheds, dry wells, drainage ditches, anywhere a child might hide or be hidden. At night, volunteers carried lanterns through the woods, their lights flickering between the trees. They found footprints, but none small enough to belong to a toddler. The yellow toy truck left in the yard remained the only tangible trace of Thomas Gibson anyone would ever recover. Behind the scenes, investigators began to rebuild the timeline. Larry said he left home at 11:30 that morning for a short jog, about 2 miles round trip, 20 minutes tops, and returned around 12:15. Judith remembered realizing Tommy was missing closer to 12:30. The call to dispatch didn't go out until 12:55. Somewhere in there was nearly half an hour that didn't add up. Then came another curious detail. Larry had taken his patrol vehicle that morning, a white sheriff's sedan emblazoned with the same department's insignia. Deputies quietly noted how unusual that was. He wasn't on duty, and the odometer showed 7 unexplained miles. When questioned, Larry said he'd driven to a nearby rest stop to check if Tommy had wandered that far. The sheriff accepted the answer but jotted down a private note. "Verify later." A few days later, a second inconsistency surfaced. Larry admitted firing his service weapon that morning, saying he'd shot at a stray cat near the ditch and missed. But when investigators revisited the scene, they found a dead gray cat about 50 yards from the road, 2 bullet wounds, one to the skull, one to the chest. Ballistics matched both rounds to Larry's pistol. One detective would later summarize it in a single sentence: "People miss, people lie, but rarely both in the same story." By the end of March, the large-scale search was over. The helicopters were grounded, the volunteers went home, and what remained was a small, tired investigative team working out of the sheriff's office, sorting statements, lab reports, and dead-end leads. A dozen tips trickled in. A boy seen at a rest stop, another spotted in a grocery store parking lot. Each one dissolved within hours. Then came a statement that turned heads, this time from 4-year-old Karen Gibson. During a quiet interview with detectives, she said she'd seen a truck pull into the driveway while her father was out jogging. Inside, she said, were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man. "They took Tommy," she whispered. "They drove away." The detectives asked her what kind of truck it was. "Yellow," she said after thinking, "or maybe brownish." Did she know the people? She shook her head. They didn't talk. Her words were written down carefully, every syllable preserved. But when the investigators checked, there were no tire tracks on the gravel road, no neighbors who'd seen or heard a vehicle that day. Still, they released the description: tan or gold pickup truck, possibly older model, 2 occupants. For weeks, that image filled Oregon highways, on flyers, in newscasts, in the rear-view mirrors of drivers who couldn't stop glancing behind them. But no such truck was ever found. Inside the department, whispers began to ripple. Officers who'd known Larry for years said he'd grown distant, detached, irritated when questioned, unwilling to speak about his son except in clipped, emotionless tones. The sheriff called a closed meeting in early April. Officially, the case of Thomas Gibson remained a missing child investigation. Unofficially, the unease had begun to spread. Behind closed doors, the sheriff's department began to ask the questions no one wanted to say out loud. Unofficially, they wondered whether something darker had happened that March morning, something that went beyond a simple disappearance. It was a fragile situation. Larry wasn't just another suspect. He was one of their own. 12 years on the force. A respected deputy. A father. A man whose home they had searched and whose wife they had hugged as she cried. But the facts refused to settle neatly into place. The jog that should have lasted 20 minutes stretched to nearly 50. The bullet that was supposed to have missed had hit its mark, and the patrol car, which should have been parked in the driveway, had somehow clocked 7 extra miles. Through it all, Larry's calm never wavered. A stillness that once looked like professionalism but now felt eerily hollow. By summer, the media lost interest. Reporters packed up, the satellite vans left town, and Alias slipped back into its quiet rhythm. The Gibson home, once swarming with investigators and volunteers, now stood still, its gravel drive covered in weeds. Judith stopped giving interviews and rarely went to church. Most days, she stayed inside with Karen, the curtains drawn. Larry returned to work in June, but his duties were reduced to filing reports and occasional patrols. Inside the department, whispers followed him like a shadow. One deputy remembered walking into the locker room to find Larry standing at the mirror, staring at his reflection for what felt like minutes. When asked how he was holding up, Larry replied evenly, "You just keep doing what you know how to do." That July, the sheriff placed him on administrative leave, citing a need for rest and perspective. Larry didn't argue. He just nodded, packed his things, and left. The investigation dragged into fall. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, reviewed phone logs, compared every statement again. But nothing had changed. No one had seen a truck. No one had heard a struggle. The yard where Tommy had played showed no signs of disturbance. No footprints but his own. The Oregon State Police confirmed what they already knew: the same 2 bullets, the same gun. But without proof that those shots had anything to do with the boy's disappearance, it was just another dead end. When Judith was interviewed again in September, she described her husband as quiet, tired, trying not to think. She still clung to the story of the mysterious truck. "Someone took him," she said. But when asked if she believed Larry's version of events completely, she hesitated. "I think," she finally said, "he tells what he can live with." By winter, the case had gone cold. The sheriff's office filed its last progress report in December 1991. The first line was painfully blunt. Investigation ongoing. Subject missing. No further developments. The Gibson family spent Christmas in silence. Karen asked where her brother was, and Judith, her voice cracking, said he was with the angels, before quickly correcting herself. "We're still looking." Larry said nothing. In early 1992, he typed a short letter on department stationery. "For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. Respectfully, Deputy Larry D. Gibson." The sheriff accepted the resignation without comment. When Larry left the building for the last time, a few colleagues lingered by the door, unsure whether to shake his hand. He nodded once and said, "Take care." The patrol car he turned in smelled faintly of disinfectant. The odometer read 58,137 miles. A few months later, the Gibsons were gone. No goodbyes, no announcement in the paper. One spring morning, movers loaded their furniture into a rental truck, and by evening, the house on the gravel road stood empty. They had quietly left Oregon behind, driving 900 miles northeast to a small town near Helena, Montana, a place where no one recognized their faces and where a man could start over without too many questions. Larry told the neighbors he'd left law enforcement to focus on family. He found work selling insurance, shaved his mustache, and traded his uniform for button-down shirts and ties. He learned to talk about coverage plans instead of search grids, small talk instead of missing persons. At first, the new town welcomed them. Members of the local Mormon congregation, hearing that the Gibsons had transferred from Oregon, helped them settle into a modest rental on a quiet street. They were just another family trying to build a normal life, or at least the version of it they could still manage to hold together. In Montana, life settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary enough from the outside. Larry joined the men's group at church on weekends, showing up early with a box of donuts and a handshake for everyone in the room. Judith brought the girls to Sunday activities, polite, composed, her smile practiced but never quite touching her eyes. For a few months, the Gibsons passed as what they so desperately wanted to be, a normal family starting over. Larry kept his job selling insurance, never late, never loud. He paid bills on time, volunteered with the local Boy Scouts again, and made sure his front lawn stayed neatly trimmed. Judith stayed home, her belly rounding as she prepared for another child. That summer, she gave birth to a daughter they named Lisa, a dark-haired baby who slept through the night and rarely cried. For a while, it felt like they had rebuilt something from the ruins of Oregon. But beneath that fragile calm, silence grew thicker by the day. Larry never talked about what had happened back home. When neighbors asked why they'd moved, he gave the same brief answer. It was a hard time. At home, he avoided the topic entirely. His days became a loop: work, church, dinner, television. Conversation dwindled to logistics and pleasantries. When Judith or Karen mentioned Tommy, he would simply leave the room. Judith tried to be patient, but she could feel the distance solidifying between them. The house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by absence. Tommy's name wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't welcome either. At night, when Judith prayed, she sometimes whispered her son's name under her breath, terrified Larry might hear. Karen, now 5, didn't understand this unspoken rule of silence. She still remembered her brother, the way he laughed, the way his toy truck rattled across the porch boards. Sometimes she'd ask where he was. Other times she woke crying, saying she'd seen him in her dreams. One night, half asleep and tangled in her blankets, she mumbled words that froze Judith in place. "Daddy hurt Tommy." It was the kind of sentence that lingers long after it's spoken, soft, fragile, but impossible to ignore. Judith whispered, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" But Karen didn't answer. By morning, she didn't seem to remember saying it at all. At church, whispers began to follow the Gibsons. People knew something tragic had happened in Oregon. A missing child, a resignation, a family that needed a fresh start. But details blurred with rumor. At first, the community reached out with casseroles and invitations to dinner. Over time, the warmth cooled into distance. Conversations quieted when Larry entered a room. One Sunday, the bishop asked gently if Larry planned to return to law enforcement. Larry gave a small shake of his head. "That part of my life's over," he said simply. He didn't mention that the Oregon State Police still had his file marked open, or that the sheriff who once called him friend now wouldn't return his calls. Judith felt the isolation more acutely than he did. She missed Oregon, not the pain, but the familiarity, the few people who still dared to ask about Tommy. In Montana, no one did. She tried to connect with other mothers, church friends, and neighbors, but conversations never went deep. It's hard to build friendships around a story you're too afraid to tell. As the months dragged on, cracks began to show in the marriage. Larry withdrew further, spending long evenings at the office or taking drives without explanation. Judith's suspicions grew, but she held her tongue. Their arguments, when they came, were quiet but cutting. "You don't talk to me anymore," she said once over dinner. Larry didn't look up. "I talk when there's something to say." After that, she stopped trying. That winter, Karen's nightmares grew worse. She'd wake up screaming, saying she saw Tommy crying near the porch or lying in the grass. Judith would sit by her bed, brushing her hair and whispering, "It's okay, baby. Everything's fine." But when Karen finally drifted back to sleep, Judith stayed awake, staring into the dark. The thought that her daughter wasn't dreaming, but remembering, crept in like a chill she couldn't shake. One afternoon, while tidying Karen's room, Judith found a crayon drawing tucked under her pillow. 4 stick figures, a man, a woman, a little girl, and another faint gray figure lying near the corner of the page. Above them, a smiling yellow sun, and stared at it for a long time before folding the paper carefully and placing it in her dresser drawer. She never told Larry she'd found it. By the start of 1993, the silence in the Gibson household had turned into something heavy, almost physical. Larry had moved to the couch, claiming the baby's crying kept him awake. Judith didn't argue. She had already begun her quiet escape, saving small bills from grocery money, writing letters to her mother back in Oregon, imagining a life where she could breathe again. When she finally told Larry she wanted to go home for a while, he didn't fight it. "Do what you need to do," he said flatly. It was the closest thing to permission he'd given her in months. So, one gray March morning, Judith packed the car, clothes, toys, bottles, diapers, and buckled the girls into the back seat. Karen clutched her stuffed bear, watching her father through the window. Larry stood in the driveway, hands deep in his pockets, expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment, searching for something in his face. Regret, love, anything, but found only distance. Then she started the car and drove away. The road wound through snow-dusted mountains, familiar and endless. The radio faded in and out, filling the silence with static. Karen slept most of the way, her head resting against the cold glass. When Judith stopped for gas near Spokane, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, drawn, older than she remembered. She realized she had waited too long to leave. 2 days later, they reached Oregon. Judith and the girls moved into her mother's small house in Eugene, sharing a cramped bedroom but feeling safer than they had in years. She found part-time work at a laundromat and began piecing together a life, slowly, quietly, like someone rebuilding from the ashes. Occasionally, she thought about calling the sheriff's office, asking for an update on Tommy's case, but every time, she stopped herself. It had been 2 years. She already knew what they'd say. No new developments. The weight of that answer felt heavier than silence. Meanwhile, Larry stayed behind in Montana, alone in the house that still smelled faintly of baby powder and coffee. He kept everything neat, the dishes washed, the floors swept, the curtains drawn. Neighbors said he was polite but distant, the kind of man who waved from his porch but never joined the conversation. He stopped mentioning his family altogether. In the evenings, he'd sit by the window, watching headlights drift past on the highway, the TV murmuring in the background, local news, sports, the steady hum of other people's lives. Sometimes, late at night, he opened a small box he kept tucked in a drawer. Inside were photographs: Tommy on his 2nd birthday, Karen with her first school ribbon, Judith smiling faintly at a picnic. He'd look at them for a few minutes, then close the box and return it to its place. He started attending church again, alone this time. When the hymn spoke of forgiveness and redemption, he stood silent, eyes fixed on the hymn book. Afterward, he'd shake hands with the bishop and leave without staying for coffee. By autumn, few people remembered the Gibsons had ever arrived as a family. To most, Larry was just the quiet insurance man who kept to himself and never talked about where he came from. When he did mention Oregon, It was as if he were recalling a half-forgotten dream. Back in Eugene, Judith noticed Karen's drawings again. They were neater now, softer, but something was always missing. One figure was gone. Sometimes the father, sometimes the brother, sometimes just an empty space. When Judith asked why, Karen would shrug. "It just feels right," she said. Judith understood. Some absences take shape even in a child's hands. In the evidence room of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the file marked Gibson, Thomas D. gathered dust. But something was still stirring, quietly, outside those records and reports. Something alive in the half-remembered corners of a little girl's mind. 3 years after Tommy Gibson disappeared, that silence finally cracked. Not through evidence, not through a new witness, but through the trembling voice of a 7-year-old child. It happened in February 1994, inside a small rental house in Eugene. Karen Gibson had grown into a cautious child with careful words and watchful eyes. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice was soft, deliberate, as if afraid of saying too much. That winter, the nightmares returned, sharper, more vivid than before. Judith would find her sitting up in bed, shaking, whispering that she'd seen Tommy outside, that she could hear Daddy yelling. At first, Judith repeated the same comforting lies she'd been telling for years. "It's just a dream, honey. Daddy didn't mean to scare you." But this time, the words didn't seem to work anymore. But the soothing words no longer worked. Karen's nightmares had begun to bleed into her waking life, and the drawings, those fragile glimpses into her memories, were growing darker. The next morning, Judith found another crayon picture on the kitchen table. It showed a man in a brown uniform standing over a smaller figure on the ground. Above them, a car with flashing lights. The scene was simple, childlike, but it froze Judith where she stood. She quietly folded the paper and slid it into a drawer, though the unease clung to her all day like a shadow. A week later, during a counseling session arranged through Karen's elementary school, that unease became something much larger. Her counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen Wright, had noticed Karen's drawings and quiet behavior. She asked gentle questions about home, about Montana, about what life was like before they moved back to Oregon. Karen hesitated at first, her eyes fixed on her shoes. Then she whispered something that made Ellen stop writing mid-sentence. That afternoon, Judith was called to the school. She found her daughter sitting in Ellen's office, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. When Ellen nodded for her to speak, Karen began haltingly, her words small but steady. "Tommy followed Daddy outside," she said. "Daddy was mad. He told Tommy to stop." She mimed a quick striking motion with her hand. Then, quieter, almost swallowed by her own breath, "He put him in the R car, the one with the lights." Judith's stomach dropped. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Karen nodded, her voice trembling. "He told me not to tell. He said he'd put me in the hole, too." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Ellen, her expression grave, documented every word. Bound by mandatory reporting laws, she contacted the Eugene Police Department that afternoon. Within 24 hours, the file on Thomas Gibson, missing since March 18, 1991, was reopened and transferred back to Douglas County. 2 detectives arrived at Judith's small rental home 2 days later. They asked her to recount everything: the disappearance, the move to Montana, the strain in the marriage, and her eventual decision to leave. When they asked about Larry's temper, Judith hesitated. Then, as if exhaling years of denial, she spoke. There had been moments, she said, small, scattered bursts when his control cracked. Once, he'd hurled a chair across the room when Karen spilled juice. Another time, he'd shouted so hard that the baby screamed for an hour. She had told herself it was grief, exhaustion, the weight of everything he'd lost. But now, she wasn't sure anymore. The detectives listened carefully, their pens moving in quiet rhythm. Before leaving, one of them met Judith's eyes and said gently, "We'll need to talk to him." Back in Montana, Larry Gibson's life looked unchanged. He still lived in the same modest house on Cedar Street, still mowed his lawn every Saturday, still nodded politely to neighbors but rarely joined their conversations. He worked as an insurance agent for a regional firm, attended church less often, and spent most nights alone. On April 14, 1994, two plainclothes officers from Oregon knocked on his door. Larry answered calmly, as if he'd been waiting for them. When they presented the warrant for second-degree murder, he didn't resist. He simply stepped aside and said evenly, "I figured this would come." Inside, the house was spotless. The curtains were drawn, the sink empty, the furniture precisely arranged. On a nearby shelf sat a single-framed photograph, Tommy smiling beneath a paper birthday hat. One of the officers paused at it before reading Larry his rights and securing the cuffs around his wrists. As they walked him out, a woman watering her garden across the street froze, hose dangling in her hand. Larry met her gaze for a brief moment and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of something she couldn't possibly understand. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. When news of his arrest reached Eugene, Judith felt her breath catch. It was a strange mixture of relief and dread. The truth she had buried for years had finally clawed its way back to the surface. She agreed to cooperate fully, handing over every letter, every document, every fragment of memory she could find. Then she called Larry's half-sister, Debbie Call, in Iowa. Debbie had kept in touch with Judith after the separation, but hadn't spoken to Larry in years. When Judith told her about the arrest, there was silence on the other end of the line, 5 long seconds of it, before Debbie finally whispered, "I was afraid this day would come." Debbie's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "I think I need to tell you something," she said quietly. A few days later, she gave her full statement to investigators. She described a late-night phone call she'd received from Larry in the spring of 1991, just weeks after Tommy disappeared. His voice, she said, was strained and uneven, the sound of a man unraveling. "I think I killed him," he had said. Those were his exact words. Debbie told police she'd pressed him for an explanation, but he refused to elaborate. "It was an accident," he said. "It all happened too fast." Then he hung up. At the time, she'd convinced herself he was having a breakdown. Grief talking, not confession. She never went to the police. "I regret that now," she told detectives. Her statement, combined with Karen's recollection, gave investigators what they'd been missing for 3 years: probable cause. The reopening of the case made headlines across Oregon. The story of the missing toddler that had faded into local legend was suddenly everywhere again. Newspapers ran the headline, "Former Deputy Charged in Son's Disappearance." The irony was impossible to miss. A lawman turned suspect in his own child's case. Detectives went back to work with fresh eyes. They revisited every shred of evidence, every inconsistency. They returned to the old Gibson property in Alia, now home to another family. The new owners allowed a full search. Investigators combed through the creek bed, the field beyond the fence, the long rotted woodpile. Nothing new surfaced, but the context had changed. What once seemed like loose ends now looked like a pattern. The extra miles on the odometer, the 45 minutes unaccounted for, the missed shot that had somehow killed a cat. Meanwhile, Larry sat in a county holding cell in Douglas County, calm as stone. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, shouting questions as he was led in and out. But he never spoke. Through his attorney, he issued a single statement: "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my son." The district attorney held a press conference the next morning. Standing before a wall of microphones, he confirmed the charge of second-degree murder. "New witness statements and corroboration of prior inconsistencies have brought this case forward," he said carefully. He didn't mention Tommy's name, but everyone knew who he meant. That night, Judith stayed home with the television turned off. Karen played quietly with her dolls in the corner, unaware of the storm that had begun to rise around her own words. Judith watched her daughter's small hands move gently through the doll's hair, and she wondered how something so innocent could have opened the door to so much darkness. As the case advanced toward trial, more pieces fell into place. Old colleagues from the sheriff's department were interviewed again. Some admitted that even back in 1991, they'd harbored doubts about Larry's story. "We wanted to believe him," one said. "He was one of us, but it never sat right." A few recalled seeing him the morning after Tommy vanished. Clean-shaven, uniform pressed, composure unshaken. One deputy remembered asking if he wanted to take time off. "No point sitting around," Larry had replied. The words, once stoic, now sounded chilling. Prosecutors built their theory. A flash of anger, a fatal blow, and a cover-up that masqueraded as heartbreak. They didn't allege premeditation, only control, concealment, and the quiet precision of a man trained to investigate others but not himself. By late April 1994, the case went before a grand jury. The indictment came swiftly. State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson, second-degree murder in connection with the death of Thomas Dean Gibson, age 2. When the story broke that evening, television stations across Oregon led with the same image. Larry, in his deputy's uniform, one hand resting proudly on his young son's shoulder. The caption read, "Father charged in son's disappearance." In Montana, neighbors watched in disbelief. To them, Larry had been the polite man who shoveled his driveway before dawn, who brought donuts to church. In Aliyah, reactions were more complicated. Grief, anger, relief. The case that had haunted the town for 3 long years had returned to life. Judith avoided reporters, ignoring every knock at the door and every ringing phone. When a close friend finally reached her, Judith's voice was quiet, hollow. "I don't feel vindicated," she said. "I just feel empty." Karen, still too young to grasp the weight of her words, looked up at her mother one evening and asked softly, "Why are people saying bad things about Daddy?" Judith knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Because sometimes," she said, "the truth takes a long time to come out." When detectives escorted Larry Gibson into the courthouse for his arraignment, he kept his chin up and his eyes forward. Photographers called, his name camera flashes slicing through the cold morning air. One reporter shouted, asking if he had anything to say to his wife. Larry didn't respond. Inside the courtroom, he stood tall as the clerk read the charges aloud. The words, "Murder in the second degree," echoed off the paneled walls. His face remained expressionless. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. As he was led out, someone in the back whispered, "That's the deputy who lost his kid." Another voice answered, "That's the one who killed him." Judith didn't attend the hearing. Instead, she sat at home with her daughters, the blinds drawn, the phone off the hook. For the first time in years, she felt something close to clarity, terrible, sharp, and undeniable. The silence that had ruled their lives was over. Outside, the light of early spring flickered across the yard, touching the corner of a faded toy box by the window. Inside, Karen sat cross-legged on the carpet, humming softly, tracing shapes with her finger. Judith watched her daughter and thought of all the years she'd spent pretending not to know what her heart had whispered from the beginning. The trial of State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson opened on a cold January morning in 1995, nearly 4 years after Tommy vanished. Snow lined the courthouse steps in Roseburg, and the air inside the old Douglas County building smelled faintly of paper, dust, and nerves. Reporters filled the benches, some from Portland, others from national outlets chasing the story of the deputy accused of killing his son. A few locals from Aliyah had driven north to see it with their own eyes. Larry sat at the defense table, back straight, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly. He looked older than 40, his hair thinner, his eyes dull from months behind bars, but he remained calm. The same quiet control that had once made him seem reliable now making him unreadable. The badge he'd worn with pride had long been surrendered. His gray suit hung loose at the collar. Judith sat near the back beside her sister. She clutched a tissue but never used it. The courtroom buzzed softly, but when Karen's name appeared on the witness list, the air seemed to still. District Attorney Michael Warner began his opening statement like a man laying out blueprints. "This is a case," he said, his voice deliberate and steady, "about a moment of anger, a moment that ended a child's life and was buried beneath 3 years of silence." He guided the jury through the morning of March 18, 1991. Larry leaving for his jog, service pistol on his hip, the shot fired at the stray cat near the road. The bullet hit its mark. Warner described how Tommy, curious as toddlers are, had wandered toward the sound, finding the dead animal near the ditch. "In that instant," Warner said, "something in Deputy Gibson broke. Frustration, pride, exhaustion. It didn't matter which came first. What mattered was what came next." The prosecutor's theory was painfully simple. Larry struck the boy, an impulsive act, a flash of anger that turned catastrophic. The blow knocked Tommy down. His small body went still, and instead of calling for help, Warner said Larry had done what he was trained to do: contain the problem. He wrapped the body in plastic, placed it in his patrol car, and drove to a remote stretch of land where he disposed of his son's remains. Then he returned home, showered, shaved, and reappeared as the calm, capable deputy who would lead the search for a child he already knew was gone. It was a theory built from fragments, an old phone call, a child's trembling memory, and the small, damning inconsistencies in a timeline. But together, they painted a picture that demanded to be heard. On the third day of trial, Karen Gibson took the stand. At 7 years old, she looked impossibly small in the witness chair. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. The judge leaned forward, kind and patient, telling her to take her time. The courtroom fell silent, every breath held. Karen spoke softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. She said she remembered that morning, the sunlight, the yard, the cat by the road. She remembered Tommy following their father, how Daddy had shouted. "He got mad," she said. "He hit Tommy and carried him to the car. Then he drove away." The prosecutor's voice was gentle. "Did your father say anything to you after that?" Karen hesitated, eyes flickering toward the defense table. Then she nodded. "He told me not to tell," she said quietly. "He said he'd put me in the hole too." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised his hand for silence. Karen's voice never cracked, never rose. She spoke with the stillness of a child who had learned that quiet was safer than truth. When she stepped down, she glanced toward her mother. Judith met her eyes and gave a small, trembling nod, the kind of gesture that said both "I'm proud of you" and "I wish you'd never had to be this brave." The defense began its case with a tone of calm precision. John Callahan, the court-appointed attorney representing Larry Gibson, rose slowly, thanked Karen for her bravery, and turned to the jury. "Memory," he began, "is not a perfect instrument, especially not when it belongs to a child who has lived through fear, loss, and years of suggestion." His voice was measured, deliberate, the cadence of a man building doubt brick by brick. Callahan's entire strategy was built on skepticism. He argued that Karen's memories had been shaped by repetition, by therapy sessions, by questions from adults, by her mother's grief pressing against silence. "She believes she remembers," he said, pacing before the jury box. "But belief is not the same as truth." He called psychologists to the stand, experts in childhood memory who spoke about the malleability of the mind. One compared it to a photograph developed in the wrong chemicals, recognizable but distorted. Then Callahan turned to the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. "No body, no blood, no weapon, no physical trace of a crime," he said, his hand slicing the air for emphasis. "What we have is a story, a tragic story, but not a single piece of tangible proof that Thomas Gibson was ever killed at all." He gestured toward Larry, seated quietly beside him. This man has been accused of the most unthinkable act imaginable. But ask yourselves, where is the evidence that it happened? Larry never took the stand. Callahan had advised against it, worried that his client's calm demeanor would read as coldness. The jury only heard Larry's voice through recordings from his police interviews. In them, his tone was even, detached. "I don't know what happened," he said again and again. "I came back and he was gone." Midway through the trial, the prosecution called Debbie Call, Larry's half-sister, to testify. She entered in a gray suit, her face pale but steady, and looked straight at her brother as she spoke. She described the late-night phone call from the spring of 1991, the one that had haunted her for years. "He sounded scared," she said softly. "He told me, 'I think I killed him.' I asked who. He said, 'Tommy.' He said it was an accident, that he didn't mean to. Then he hung up." When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, her eyes fell to the floor. "Because I didn't want to believe it," she said. "You tell yourself you misunderstood, that it was a dream. You just don't want it to be true." The defense struck back, questioning her memory, noting that no phone record from that year existed and that stress could alter recollection. But her words lingered in the air, unshaken by logic. Next came Judith. She entered quietly, her face drawn but composed, and took the stand. She spoke of their life together. Larry, the respected deputy, disciplined and devout. But beneath that image, she said, lived a man whose temper could ignite without warning. "He wasn't always violent," she said carefully. "But when he was angry, it was like he wasn't there anymore." She told the court about a night in Montana when he'd struck the wall beside her head so hard the picture frames rattled. "He told me once," she added, voice trembling, "people think I'm the law, but they don't know me at home." The courtroom fell utterly silent. By the 5th week, the case had become a battle between memory and evidence, between what people remembered and what could be proven. Experts debated psychology. Detectives revisited timelines. Attorneys dissected the meaning of intent. There were moments when the case seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Too much contradiction, too little proof. In closing arguments, District Attorney Michael Warner returned to the core of his case. He didn't speak of theories or psychology, only of what couldn't be ignored. "A healthy child vanished," he said, his voice low but firm. His father's story never fit. His daughter remembered what she saw. His sister remembered what he confessed. You don't need to find the body to recognize the truth. When Callahan rose for his rebuttal, his tone was precise, almost surgical. "We don't convict on feelings," he said. "We convict on facts, and there are none here. If Thomas Gibson is gone, we don't know how or why or by whose hand. To punish a man on uncertainty is to destroy the very justice he once swore to protect." The jury filed out in silence. Judith stayed home during deliberations, the phone beside her on the kitchen counter, every ring, or lack of one, stretching time thin. Larry sat motionless in his cell, eyes fixed on the wall, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. For 2 days, the courthouse waited in stillness. On the morning of the 3rd day, the courtroom filled to capacity. The bailiff's voice carried across the hushed air. "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone rose as the 12 jurors filed in, faces solemn, the foreman holding a single folded piece of paper. The clerk accepted it, unfolded it carefully, and began to read. "On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, we find the defendant not guilty." A collective breath wavered through the room. Then came the second line. "On the lesser charge of manslaughter in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty." The air shifted, heavy and uncertain. Larry exhaled once, his eyes fixed straight ahead, face unmoving. Judith closed hers, her expression unreadable, her shoulders trembling only once before she steadied herself. The judge thanked the jurors for their service and turned to sentencing. Under Oregon law, 1st-degree manslaughter carried a sentence of 15 to 18 months. Because Larry had already spent most of that time in custody awaiting trial, the sentence amounted to little more than a formality. When the gavel struck, the sound didn't echo like justice. It landed like closure written out of exhaustion. Reporters rushed toward the exits, already calling in their headlines. Deputy convicted in son's death. Manslaughter, not murder. Outside, voices clashed in the winter air. Some called it mercy. Others called it failure. Judith left through the side door, walking quickly toward her car, her head bowed against the shouting questions. One reporter called after her, "Do you think justice was done?" She didn't turn, didn't speak. Inside, Larry stood silently as his attorney leaned close and whispered something in his ear. He nodded once, expression blank. By evening, the courthouse steps were empty. The cameras were gone. The echoes of footsteps faded, leaving behind only the old building's breath and the weight of a story that had started 4 years earlier in a small Oregon yard. Larry Gibson was released from the Oregon State Penitentiary in September 1996, barely 18 months after his conviction. He had served nearly the entire sentence during the long pre-trial months in custody. When the prison gates opened that morning, no family waited. No cameras lined the fence. No crowd stood to witness it. Only a single parole officer waited beside a government sedan. The officer handed him a manila folder, release papers, supervision conditions, and an envelope containing $47 in cash. Larry signed the final form, nodded politely, and stepped into the pale Oregon light. He was 43 years old and looked closer to 50. His hair had thinned at the temples, his movements slowed, his once straight posture softened by time and confinement. He didn't glance back at the prison. In the weeks that followed, he disappeared quietly, resettling under the shortened name L.D. Gibson in a modest Montana town. He rented a small apartment above a hardware store and found work as an insurance adjuster at a local firm. No one asked questions, and he didn't offer answers. On the employment forms, the line marked "Children" was left blank. Parole reports from that period were uneventful. Polite, cooperative, emotionally flat, one officer wrote. He checked in on time, completed his community service, kept his head down. To the system, he was simply another man completing the terms of release. But outside the paperwork, the case still burned in public memory. Oregon remained divided. Some saw the verdict as an imperfect mercy. "It was an accident," one neighbor told a reporter. "A good man lost his temper and panicked. That doesn't make him evil." Others called it a betrayal of justice. "A father killed his child and walked free," another said. "If his name weren't Gibson, he'd still be in prison." Editorials argued for months. One headline read, "Deputy or criminal? Oregon still split on the Gibson case." Another was more cutting, "When a badge becomes a shield." And back in Alea, the small house at the end of the gravel road still stood. Same porch, same narrow yard, same rusted swing. A young couple lived there now, their 2 children playing in the grass where Tommy Gibson once pushed his toy truck through the morning dew. When a local reporter asked if they ever felt uneasy about the home's history, the husband smiled and shook his head. "No," he said. "This place isn't haunted. It's just quiet." "We just don't talk about it," the new homeowner said softly. "It's easier that way." By then, Judith had long refused every interview request. She and the girls had built quiet, new lives in a small town outside Eugene, living under her maiden name. The local school listed Karen and Lisa under their stepfather's surname after Judith remarried briefly in 1998. When a reporter from Portland finally knocked on her door, she opened it just wide enough to speak. "That part of our lives is over," she said, closing it gently. Her silence was total, but it wasn't empty. Larry Gibson's silence was different. He never truly disappeared. In early 2001, with an old desktop computer and a borrowed dial-up connection, he built a simple website on a free hosting platform. The title page read, searching for the truth about Tommy. The site was primitive, plain white background, black text, no photos. At the top, a single statement. My name is Larry Gibson. I am a father. My son disappeared in 1991 from our home in Alia, Oregon. I was wrongfully accused and convicted of his death. I served my time, but I will not rest until the truth is found. He updated the page sporadically, posting scanned court documents, grainy newspaper clippings, and essays written in a detached, almost bureaucratic tone. There was no body, no cause of death, no motive, one entry read. My daughter's memory was manipulated through therapy and suggestion. In another he wrote, If Tommy is still alive, I pray that one day he will read this. Few ever stumbled upon the page, but those who did were divided. Some offered sympathy, others seethed with anger. You're a liar, one anonymous message read. You don't get to call it truth. Larry never replied. By 2003, the domain expired, and the website vanished. Just another broken link in the early internet's graveyard. But the Gibson case never truly vanished with it. In the mid-90s, Unsolved Mysteries had featured the story twice. Once in 1994, before the arrest, portraying Larry as a heartbroken father desperate for answers, and again in 1996, after his conviction, reframing it as a cautionary tale about deception and trust. Robert Stack's steady voice narrated the mystery. How could a trained officer of the law lose his son within sight of his own front porch? And what really happened on that quiet morning in March, 1991? Both broadcasts reignited public debate. Letters flooded the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and the Oregon State Police tip line. Some swore they had seen a boy resembling Tommy years later. Others accused the department of protecting one of their own. None of the tips led anywhere. Before the trial, in 1993, Tommy's photograph had also appeared in Soul Asylum's Runaway Train music video, the haunting montage that showed missing children's faces to millions. He was the youngest featured child, his baby blue eyes blinking briefly on screens across the world. The caption beneath his picture read, If you've seen this child, please call. By the time the video re-aired in 1996, court documents had already listed him as deceased, though no remains had ever been found. The contradiction went unaddressed. Still, for Haren, those fleeting seconds, Tommy's face lived again, frozen between lyrics of loss and escape, broadcast to strangers who'd never know his name. It was as close to immortality as a missing child could get in Douglas County. That same year, the sheriff's office boxed up the Gibson case file. The binders, labeled Gibson TD, Missing Person, Open Unresolved, were stored in the evidence annex. Inside were maps of search grids, Polaroid photos of the yard, interview transcripts, and one final sheet stamped in red. Case status, closed. Exceptional clearance. The official record still called it a disappearance. The word murder appeared nowhere. Years later, a young detective newly assigned to the department stumbled across the box. He spent hours leafing through the brittle pages before closing the lid. It felt, he said quietly, like looking at something that wanted to keep its secrets. For the family, those secrets never stopped casting their shadow. Judith kept no photographs of Larry in the house. Karen, now a teenager, learned not to answer questions when people asked about her father. When classmates discovered old news stories online, she'd shrug and say they were about someone else. Lisa, the youngest, knew her father only through yellowed newspaper clippings and her mother's silences. Years later, in a rare interview, Judith's sister spoke about him one last time. I forgave him, she said, but not the way people think. Not forgiveness that frees you, just the kind that lets you sleep. In Montana, Larry aged quietly. He bought a small trailer outside a logging town, planted tomatoes, and kept to himself. He told neighbors he was divorced, that his son had died young. He never mentioned the trial. Once a year, on March 18th, he left flowers near the edge of a creek just beyond town. When a neighbor once asked who they were for, he said softly. For my boy. He's still out there somewhere. No cameras, no reporters, no search teams. Just a man and his reflection in the water. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share the episode, because somewhere, someone may still be waiting to be heard. Decades have passed, but the silence around Tommy Gibson's disappearance still lingers like fog over Alia. No body was ever found, no absolute answers ever written. Just a grieving mother, a haunted father, and a small town that learned to live with questions instead of closure. Some say justice was done. Others say it never even began. What do you believe happened that day? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, share, and keep the memory of the missing alive, because somewhere someone may still be waiting to be heard.